actually said to me, you ought to do it. And I said, look, I don't need to do that. I'm not down to do this. This is your...
I was a separated wife of the Prince of Wales. I was a problem, full stop. Never happened before. What do we do with her?
A forgotten letter, and a name no one expected, Princess Anne. That's how it all began. Hidden in the corner of a crumbling estate in Essex, a dusty wooden box sat quietly beneath piles of long-forgotten furniture. No one had touched it in decades. But in early 2024, while the estate was being catalogued for auction, an assistant stumbled upon an unremarkable container holding a single, extraordinary secret. Inside was a cream-colored envelope, its edges yellowed by time, but still intact. And right there, pressed firmly into the back flap, was something no one could mistake: the unmistakable red wax crest of Princess Diana. This wasn't some reproduction or modern replica. This was the real thing. The seal bore Diana's personal mark, one she had reserved only for her most intimate and guarded communications. Unlike her many thank you notes or media-addressed letters, this one was private. It hadn't been intended for the public eye, nor even for royal historians. This letter had a very specific purpose, and what stunned everyone wasn't just its authenticity, but the person it was addressed to: Princess Anne, the one royal Diana was never known to be close with. The one woman in the palace whose relationship with Diana had always seemed, at best, distant, and at worst, cold. Royal archivists moved quickly. The envelope was examined, its texture and ink tested, handwriting compared against countless other samples. And the verdict was unanimous. It was real, dated sometime in the summer of 1997, mere weeks before Diana's final fateful trip to Paris. A moment, frozen in time, captured in handwriting, and sealed under wax. But that was just the beginning, because this letter hadn't been preserved in any royal archive or family safe. It had vanished. For years, it drifted quietly through the hands of private collectors, auction houses, and wealthy royal enthusiasts. Nobody knew exactly how it slipped through the cracks. The first person to take possession of the letter was a senior palace aide. He'd been instructed to safeguard it. But after Diana's death and the media frenzy that followed, he chose not to report it. Whether out of fear or reverence, he handed it off to a collector known for dealing with royal memorabilia, someone who kept his acquisitions strictly off the record. That collector, in turn, sold the letter to a retired banker named Thomas Henderson in 2001. Henderson was a known history buff, someone fascinated by Britain's aristocracy. But oddly, he never opened it, never displayed it. Just kept it tucked, away in his study drawer. For over 2 decades, it sat there, untouched. When Henderson died in 2023, his estate was turned over to an auction team for valuation. One assistant, while sorting his private belongings, recognized the wax seal and knew instantly that this wasn't just any letter. Experts were called. Tests were run. And soon, the royal world buzzed with a single urgent question. What had Diana written? And more importantly, why had she written it to Anne? But what would Diana have said to a woman she barely spoke to? One was warmth and rebellion, the other duty and restraint. Yet both were bound by the crown. Princess Diana and Princess Anne couldn't have been more different in how they moved through the same gilded world. Where Diana embraced the spotlight with an open heart, Anne deflected it with an iron will. Diana was the people's princess, emotive, charismatic, and willing to challenge royal norms with raw sincerity. She walked through landmine zones barefoot, hugged AIDS patients, and comforted crying children on camera. Her empathy was her power, but for Anne, duty was the crown's true weight. She didn't need applause. She needed purpose, and she fulfilled it with relentless consistency, year after year, far from flashing cameras. This stark contrast was never lost on the public or the palace. Diana was all heart, speaking through emotion. Anne was all spine, silent but solid. Diana wanted to modernize the monarchy with openness. Anne wanted to protect it through discipline. The tension between their royal philosophies was subtle but unmistakable. While Diana redefined the role of a royal woman by wearing vulnerability-like armor, Anne stuck to the old guard, formal, precise, unfazed. It was clear they rarely saw eye to eye. But what's most striking is that they rarely spoke at all, at least not publicly. The silence between them wasn't dramatic, it was heavy, lingering. And for years it created a quiet speculation. Was it disdain? Indifference? Or something the world never understood? As Diana's humanitarian efforts made front-page news across the globe. Anne's engagements quietly filled the royal calendar. Hundreds of them. Without fanfare. Without fan clubs. To some, it felt like Anne existed in the monarchy's background, a machine that never stopped working. To Diana, it may have looked like coldness. But in time, that silence began to take on a different weight, a kind of strength, unmoving, enduring. In Anne, Diana began to see not a rival or a critic, but a pillar, a woman who never buckled, never played to the press, and never broke under pressure. While others were distracted by their differences, Diana began to notice something deeper. And that's what makes Diana's letter so shocking, because she didn't write it to someone she adored or trusted implicitly. She wrote it to the one woman who had been a quiet constant in the chaos. The one who didn't chase cameras. The one who never flinched. The letter was not just a message, it was a gesture, an offering. Diana didn't choose Anne because they were close. She chose Anne because, in her final months, she was looking for someone who would still be standing when everything else collapsed. And perhaps that strength was exactly what Diana needed for what came next. Why did this letter disappear for nearly 30 years? That's the question that shook Buckingham Palace when the truth finally surfaced. It wasn't lost, it wasn't stolen. It was hidden intentionally, quietly, and in plain sight. And the story behind that silence is perhaps even more unsettling than the contents of the letter itself. In the final weeks of her life, Diana made a decision that no one in the royal family expected. She penned a deeply personal message and handed it, sealed with her red wax crest, to a trusted senior palace staffer. There were no instructions, no explanation, just a few firm words. Keep it safe. That was it. The envelope was sealed, but so was its purpose. The staffer never asked questions. Perhaps he was too afraid. Perhaps he understood too well the weight of what he was holding. But instead of delivering it to an archive or returning it to the family after Diana's death, he did something few could explain. He handed it over to a royal memorabilia collector. Thought exchange was done quietly, off the books. This wasn't someone who advertised their acquisitions to the world. This was a man who specialized in keeping history private, preserved, and, in some cases, permanently hidden. But he never read the letter, never even opened it. And within a year, he sold it again this time to someone who seemed to have no idea of its emotional and historical significance. In 2001, a retired banker named Thomas Henderson purchased the letter at a private auction. A quiet man with a lifelong passion for British history, Henderson was known for collecting royal artifacts. But unlike others in his circle, he had no interest in showcases or museum exhibits. His treasures were kept away from prying eyes, stored with care, but never shared. For over 2 decades, the letter lay untouched in a wooden drawer in his study. Not forgotten, but preserved like a secret between strangers. Henderson never spoke about it. Not to colleagues, not to family. The red seal remained unbroken, the mystery preserved in silence. And then, in early 2024, after Henderson's passing, the story took a dramatic turn. As his estate was catalogued for auction, a young assistant sorting through personal belongings stumbled upon the envelope. The crest caught her attention immediately. It wasn't decorative, it was royal. And more importantly, it was Diana's. Experts were brought in swiftly. Forensic analysts, handwriting specialists, historians. And their findings sent shockwaves through the monarchy. It was real. Every fiber of the paper, every line of ink, every swirl in Diana's hurried script, all of it pointed to authenticity. This wasn't a copy. It was her voice, her fear, her final request. And until that moment, it had never seen the light of day. But that was about to change. Because the moment the seal cracked, everything changed. This wasn't a royal decree. It was a mother's final hope. Beneath the red wax seal and elegant handwriting, Diana's letter held no titles, no formality, and no signature crafted for diplomacy. It was raw, honest, written not as Her Royal Highness, but as a terrified mother staring down a future she would not live to see. In that letter, Diana stripped away the crown, the protocol, the spectacle. What remained were the unfiltered fears of a woman who knew, deep in her bones, that the walls of the palace would not protect her sons from what was coming. And so, she turned to the one person no one expected Princess Anne to be. Diana had always sensed the monarchy was changing, but not in the way people hoped. It was becoming slick, curated, hollow. What once stood for service was becoming a brand. She feared the institution that shaped her sons would soon demand performance over principle. Her greatest worry wasn't whether William would be king, it was whether he'd lose himself trying to become one. And Harry, the more sensitive of the two, was even more at risk. Diana had already seen how the spotlight scorched rather than illuminated. She'd felt the claws of the press, the coldness of palace machinery, and the crushing pressure to smile through torment. She feared her boys would be forced to do the same. That's why she didn't write to her closest friends. That's why she didn't address it to Charles or even the Queen. She wrote to Anne, the royal who had never sought applause, the one woman who moved through chaos with calm. Diana didn't need Anne to become a second mother. She needed her to be a steady force, a guardian of values, a protector of character. Not through hugs or bedtime stories, but through consistency, through presence, through sheer, unshakable endurance. In the letter, Diana admitted what so few ever heard from her directly, that she and Anne were never close, but she admired her, not for affection, but for resolve, for composure, for the rare strength that doesn't break under headlines or palace drama. Diana believed that after she was gone, William and Harry would be surrounded by advisors, traditions, and empty expectations, but very few people who would remind them who they were. That's what she asked Anne, not to coddle, not to comfort, but to anchor, to guide her sons by example, to embody the kind of unyielding strength that Diana knew her boys would one day crave. Every sentence was layered with emotion, not the dramatic, public-facing kind, but the quiet ache of someone desperately trying to control the uncontrollable. Diana's love for her sons wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. She didn't just want them loved, she wanted them protected from the royal machinery that had nearly destroyed her. Her plea wasn't sentimental, it was calculated, purposeful, and deeply maternal. She wasn't asking Anne to change. She was asking her to continue being exactly who she was, just with William and Harry quietly in her line of sight. There was no demand, no guilt, just a request etched in ink and sealed in wax for Anne to be the silent shield in a world that would soon try to reshape the princes into symbols rather than sons. It was Diana's way of reaching into the future, of offering her boys one last gift, the kind of strength that doesn't need to be seen to be felt. But the true power of Diana's words came in what she warned would come next. Diana didn't just fear for her sons, she foresaw a royal crisis. Long before headlines spoke of division, and long before Harry stepped away from the monarchy, Diana sensed the storm brewing beneath the surface. In her letter to Anne, she didn't use vague pleasantries or cryptic royal language. She was clear, direct, and hauntingly precise. The monarchy, she warned, was becoming something she no longer recognized. It was drifting away from its people, away from its purpose, and dangerously close to becoming a performance wrapped in tradition rather than a legacy rooted in truth. She feared the crown was being polished, while the foundation underneath it cracked. Diana wrote of a future where duty would clash with identity, where William and Harry would be forced to choose between who they were and who they were expected to be. She knew better than anyone the cost of that choice. She had lived it, smiled through it, nearly drowned in it. And she didn't want her boys to be next. She feared William, the heir, would be molded into an image, a figurehead, polished for perfection but stripped of personal voice. And she feared Harry, so emotionally open, would rebel against it all and, in doing so, be cast out, misunderstood, and left to carry the burden of his own truth alone. So she gave Anne a task, not a royal command, but a personal mission to protect their authenticity. Remind them, when no one else would, of who they really are. Diana didn't expect Anne to speak out, to challenge the institution publicly. That was never Anne's way. But she believed Anne could offer something quieter, something stronger, a presence rooted in unwavering honesty. She asked Anne to carry her teachings in subtle ways. A word here, a gesture there. Not grand declarations, but reminders. Gentle, consistent reminders that character mattered more than protocol. That kindness was strength. That humanity was never a weakness. And then came the eerie part. The part of the letter that chills the spine. Diana predicted that if the institution did not change, if it continued prioritizing optics over truth, one of her sons would walk away. She didn't say which one, but she knew it was coming. And years later, when Harry and Meghan left the palace and the headlines exploded with royal shockwaves, those who had seen the letter could only whisper one thing. Diana saw it coming. Not because she had insider knowledge, but because she understood the pressure. She knew what it meant to suffocate inside a gold-plated cage. She had felt it in her bones, and she knew her sons would too. Her letter wasn't just a plea to Anne. It was a warning to the future. A message buried in wax and paper, now rising like prophecy. She wasn't trying to destroy the monarchy. She was trying to save it from itself. But would Anne, so different from Diana, ever act on this heartfelt request? The woman once called emotionless began to change, and few noticed. For decades, Princess Anne had been the no-nonsense royal, the iron figure in pearls who embodied duty, without the frills of sentiment. The public respected her, but they didn't feel close to her. She wasn't the people's princess. She wasn't warm, or flashy, or vulnerable. She was efficient, constant, unwavering. But something subtle began to shift in the years after Diana's death. Quietly, gradually, as if the ghost of a letter no one had seen was gently guiding her path from behind the scenes. Anne's public appearances took on a slightly different tone. While she continued to champion the same causes, she began to step into spaces that had once been dominated by Diana youth programs, mental health initiatives, and community outreach. It wasn't a radical transformation, but a quiet expansion of presence. Where once she might have stood at a distance, now she engaged more closely, listened more patiently, responded more warmly. It wasn't theatrical, it was intentional. And for those watching closely, it felt like more than just a natural progression. It felt like a subtle fulfillment of a promise. Her moments with William became more visible too. At public events, where once she might have stood stoically beside him, she was now seen offering small but telling gestures, brief words, a touch on the arm, and shared glances that spoke of support rather than formality. These weren't grand statements. They were whispers of connection. Whispers that echoed what Diana had asked for. Guidance, not instruction. Strength, not control. Presence, not dominance. And with Harry, the silence was even more telling. When he chose to walk away from the royal fold, voices across the institution rang with criticism, but Anne's voice was not among them. She said nothing publicly. No condemnation, no defense, only stillness. And that silence, so often misread in the past, now seemed to carry weight. It was a silence of understanding, of respect. As if Anne, bound by the letter's contents, had chosen to honor Diana's wishes not by speaking them aloud, but by living them. While others speculated, Anne simply observed, perhaps seeing in Harry what Diana had always seen, a boy who needed space to breathe, not more rules to follow. Through it all, Anne never sought attention for these changes. She didn't rebrand herself. She didn't issue statements or give interviews about personal growth. She simply evolved, steadily, authentically, the same way she'd always done her work. But now, there was something different in the way she moved through her duties. A gentler edge, a hint of something deeper. And for those who remembered the letter, the question became inescapable. Was this simply coincidence, or had Diana's final request quietly reshaped a royal legacy? Anne never replied, but she did something far more powerful than she acted. Without fanfare, without speeches, and without ever acknowledging the letter's existence, she began to move through the royal world in a new way. While others debated Diana's legacy in public, Anne became the embodiment of it in private. Not through dramatic gestures or headline-grabbing declarations, but through consistency, through presence, through the kind of quiet strength Diana had so desperately hoped her sons would one day be surrounded by. As the years passed, Anne became something neither William nor Harry had truly expected: a grounding presence. Not interfering, not commanding, but steady. She showed up for engagements, for family moments, for public appearances that might have once been little more than formal obligations. And something shifted. Her presence no longer felt obligatory, it felt intentional. When William began championing mental health awareness, stepping beyond royal traditions to speak about emotion and vulnerability, Anne didn't just nod in approval. She stood beside him, not in the spotlight, but close enough to be felt. Her support was real, unwavering, and quiet, just as Diana had hoped it would be. She never chased the press, never inserted herself into the narratives swirling around the family. Even as the royal institution wrestled with modern identity and media chaos, Anne remained untouched by scandal and distraction. Her silence became a statement of its own. She did not explain. She did not correct. She simply lived with dignity, with purpose. And in doing so, she mirrored exactly what Diana had asked for: authenticity. Not the curated kind, but the deeply lived kind. The kind that didn't need to be said to be seen. Over time, the public began to notice. The once emotionless princess seemed different. Softer, perhaps. More engaged. But no one could pinpoint. Why? She hadn't changed dramatically. She had just become more visible in the ways that mattered. She didn't seek credit. And that made her impact even more powerful. Because what Anne was doing wasn't for cameras, legacy, or applause. It was for the promise she had never publicly acknowledged, but perhaps always held close. She never spoke of the letter, never once confirmed what had been written or why Diana had chosen her. And yet, through every gesture, every quiet moment of solidarity with William, every respectful silence in the face of Harry's departure, Anne gave her answer. She had read the letter, not with her eyes, but her actions. She had listened, not to the words, but to the woman behind them. Anne had become the silent guardian Diana had envisioned. And while she remained composed, restrained, and fiercely private, the ripple of her actions carried far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Because while Anne stayed silent, the letter's legacy only grew louder. A letter not meant for history, but one that may have changed it. Sealed in wax and buried in silence, it was never written to inspire headlines or shape the future of the IB monarchy. And yet, that's exactly what it did. Because within those pages, Diana offered something far more powerful than a message. She offered a mission. A final gift, wrapped not in sentiment, but in strategy. And the person she entrusted, it wasn't someone known for warmth or affection. It was Anne the Royal, most defined by silence, service, and restraint. But perhaps that's why Diana chose her. Diana didn't ask Anne to comfort. She didn't ask her mother, or mend or speak for her memory. She asked her to do what no one else could, to remain steady, to endure, to protect something fragile not through loud declarations, but through quiet examples. And Anne, without ever publicly acknowledging the letter's contents, did just that. In the years that followed, she stepped into roles that once might have seemed at odds with her nature. She connected more, engaged more, listened more, and she did it without changing who she was, only expanding the space she was willing to hold. What began as a private plea became a public transformation. Anne didn't shift the monarchy overnight. She didn't overhaul its traditions or redefine its structure, but in subtle, unmistakable ways, she moved it closer to Diana's vision. A monarchy that wasn't just about duty, but about humanity. A family that didn't just stand tall, but stood true. And while others spoke endlessly about modernizing the crown, Anne simply modeled it without fanfare, without reward, without recognition. And the impact rippled. William grew into a leader who speaks openly about mental health, vulnerability, and connection. Harry, though now estranged from the institution, echoes his mother's voice with every step he takes toward authenticity. And through it all, Anne has remained in the background, not silent out of detachment, but quiet out of respect. Her restraint has become her strength. Her actions, her answer. And in that answer lies the truth. The letter wasn't just a farewell. It was a roadmap. Diana saw what few others did, that sometimes the greatest power lies not in those who speak the most, but in those who act with purpose when no one is watching. She didn't entrust her final hopes to the most beloved, the most emotional, or the most public. She gave them to the one who would carry them without question, without applause, and without ever claiming ownership. Because Diana knew what legacy really is. It isn't loud. It doesn't beg to be seen. It moves quietly in the hearts of those who carry it forward. And so, as we look at the subtle changes in the royal family, the evolution of Anne's role, and the enduring spirit of Diana's sons, we're left with one final question. Not for history, not for the press, but for us. So now we ask, did Diana choose the right person after all? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.